having myself spent quite a lot of time sitting in classrooms, being taught, being the passive recipient of a lot of knowledge, I'm very sensitive to teaching as an art form, and indeed to distinguish between a good teacher and a bad one. Now, I've encountered quite a number of indifferent teachers, both at secondary school level and at university. But my memories, looking back now over 40 or more years, are of those teachers who were really good and who made a big impression on me. My primary school teacher, Molly Patton, in Dunalley National School in the countryside of County Sligo, is one that comes immediately to mind. And there was Father Brendan Woods, my history teacher, Clongowes, whom I remember with great affection as well. And then there were one or two lecturers at university who made a very deep impression. I learned a great deal from them, but also I think what impressed me most was the ease and the authority with which they taught. Now, in the gospel today, we meet the teaching Jesus. He comes to the synagogue in Capernaum. John tells us that he'd already set up house in Capernaum, so he would have been known by the people. And so when he came to the synagogue, his face at least was familiar to them. But quite clearly, the way in which he taught, the way in which he expounded on and explained the scriptures, and one presumes also his body language, perhaps the eye contact he had with the people, the feeling which they had that he was speaking, yes, directly to them, about something with which he himself was familiar, made a very deep impression, and they said, he's teaching us something new. Isn't it amazing? And he's teaching with authority. Now, I remember myself looking back over those teachers who made an impression on me and from whom I felt I learned a great deal, whether it be about history or the Irish language in the case of Molly Patton, or a theology at a later stage, and philosophy too. These were men and women who clearly knew their subject matter well. But more than that, they loved it. They were anxious to communicate the knowledge they had with a desire to enriching and informing others. I remember particularly Professor Gérard Verbeke, who was one of the great luminaries of Louvain when I was a student there. And he introduced me to the rather complex thought of the Greek philosopher Plotinus, and then to the church father Origen. I certainly wouldn't pass an exam on either of those subjects with flying colors now, but I remember watching him teach us. And I said, this is a man who knows Plotinus or knows Origen profoundly, and he wants us to know about it as well. So he's somebody who spent a great deal of time thinking about and reading the works of these respective philosophers. And the same would be true of the philosophy I learned in Dublin or the history I learned when I was a boy at school. Transfer all these impressions to the teaching Jesus. What gave him his authority? What made him so special? What was it about the way in which he preached, which drew crowds of people to hear him, not just in the synagogues, but Mark tells us that they came from the four corners of the Palestine of his day. Mark, the evangelist, we're reading in year B at the present time. He describes the crowds gathered around the lake, the crowds in the public squares. And this was the time before there were any microphones or loudspeakers. What was it about Jesus that attracted them? It must have been the way in which they sensed he knows what he's talking about. And if he's talking about a God of love, a God who cares, a God who wants to be a part of our lives, then he must already be a part of his. He's teaching us something that is new, they said. But the Jewish scriptures were hundreds of years old. They'd heard it all before. They'd been listening to rabbis since they were small children. What was it about Jesus, the teacher, that made the difference? And I imagine that looking back with the advantage of years, that the four evangelists, and Mark in particular, was sensitive to the fact that Jesus had a real existential knowledge of the God about whom he was speaking. And what made the teaching new? We're used to the notion of the angry God of the Israelites, the one who felt aggrieved by their infidelities, the one who threatened them, even though at the heart of their notion of God was also the idea that the Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. And I imagine that a lot of Jesus' teaching was focused on that image of God, of the God of love, of the God who valued each and every person. And in today's gospel, in the synagogue of Capernaum, we hear actually nothing about the content of Jesus' teaching other than the impression that it made. But we hear how Jesus expelled an evil spirit from a man who was possessed. So I like to think that in the teaching of Jesus, the people sensed the triumph of good over evil. He was teaching them about a God who was fundamentally good, who wished people well, who had the power to heal and to cure, who had the power to expel all that was evil. And didn't his authority come from the fact that he could command the evil spirits to leave the man who was possessed? The God whom Jesus preached was the God who purifies the evil out of all our hearts if we respond to the call to conversion, as so many had done in response to John the Baptist on the banks of the Jordan. So, in conclusion then, the Jesus we meet today is Jesus the teacher. Jesus who clearly knew what he was talking about. Not only was he familiar with the Jewish scriptures and the images of God which fill its pages, but he also knew God personally through prayer, through thinking, and through the intense moral goodness of his own personality. And the second thing that gave him authority, in addition to probably his body posture, the tone of voice in which he spoke, that sureness of touch which he had with pedagogical skills, but it was above all the generosity of his scholarship. He wasn't keeping all his knowledge to himself. He was burning with enthusiasm to pass on that knowledge to others. And of course, in the scriptures read to us week by week in church when we gather together in the assembly, we all feel that it is God who is speaking to us, addressing the real concerns of our world, and assuring us of that truth, that reality that all of us need, is that he is a God who loves his people and indeed loves you and me as well.